feel privileged that Baruch Hashem, due to our technological advances, and thanks to Maishi and to Jeremy, that I'm able at least to be with you virtually today. And it would be impossible to miss this daf, being that this is our second to last day of Maseches Yevamos. And in Meretz Hashem, I will be there in person with you for the last daf. So today's daf is Kuf Chaf Aleph 121. I will say we are picking up on Kuf Chaf Amud Beis 120b, and we left off with Ini, which is 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. Kuf Chaf Amud Beis 120b. So I will say, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, the Mishnah quoted the idea that Allah Lamaisa, seeing someone in a situation that looks like there's no way they could survive, is not enough to be able to give testimony that they are in fact dead, so as to allow their wife to remarry. In order to be able to testify that a man is dead, you have to actually have seen him died. So therefore, again, the Mishnah gives an example. You see someone being devoured by a wild animal. Unless, of course, you actually see them dead, halacha l'maisa, again, you cannot assume that they have died. So the Gemara gave an example of this, of someone shachat b'orov shnayim. Let's say someone chas v'shalom had their throat slit. So again, slit the trachea and the windpipe. So the Gemara says, in such a situation like this, a person is not going to survive. So if you see a person chas v'shalom with this type of injury, it is clear that they are not going to survive and they are effectively dead. So the Gemara says, Ini, is that so? V'amar Rav Yehuda Shmuel. Rav Yehuda is the name of Shmuel. Shachat bo shnayim urav shnayim v'ramaz v'amar kisu get leishti hare elo yichtavu v'yitnu. So what about the fact that we saw that Allah, again, I read this yesterday, but it's kedai just to repeat it. What about if a man had the majority of the two simanim slit, and then he motioned to someone to write a get for his wife? He doesn't want his wife, let's say, to fall to Yibum, so he writes a get. So what's the halacha? So the Hari Elu Yichtavu V'yitnu. Ultimately, halacha l'maisa, you write the get. So what do you see from here? You see from here that a person who has the two simanim slit is still considered to be alive. To which the Gemara says, no. Chayhu v'sof olamos. No. What it means is, right now he's alive, but l'maisa, what it means is, we know that he's definitely going to die as a result of these injuries. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, this is quite interesting. There's a concept of galus. Galus is if you kill someone accidentally, inadvertently, the halacha is that one is not put to death for such an act. Rather, one is sent to galus, one is sent into exile. So Zok the Gemara, ask the Gemara, so if that's the case, that we know that a person is definitely going to die, if you cut the two simanim, so watch this, so the Gemara says, Alamatanya, Shachat Shnaim Orov Shnaim Hareze Eino Gola. Here's the problem. Using this logic, if let's say Reuven accidentally caught the windpipe and trachea of Shimon, he should have to go to Galus, right? Again, it's accidental murder. He should have to go to Galus. Yet we know the halacha is that he's not obligated to go to Galus. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, no. Ha'itmar lo amravoshia chayshinan shama haruach bilbalto. Inami shema ihu tapav kuf chafalev kirev misaso. So I will say, here's the issue. The concern is if Reuben accidentally cuts the simonim, the windpipe and the trachea of Shimon, the concern is like this: maybe there was some airflow that got in, and it's that airflow that kind of cemented Shimon's fate. Or maybe Shimon himself moved or writhed in pain, and as a result, he tore the simonim even more, therefore ultimately bringing about his death. So it's interesting. So in other words, what the Gemara says is, so there's a confluence of a number of different halachas over here. We'll say for our Mishnah, or let's work backwards. In the halacha of Galus, when do you get sent to Galus? If you did something which accidentally caused the death of someone else. But there has to be a direct result between your actions and the death of the individual. If there's some other factor at play that at the end of the day would cause the death of the individual, then you don't go to Galus for that. That's why the Gemara says something very interesting. So if Reuven accidentally cuts the trachea and windpipe of Shimon, Reuven doesn't go to Galus. Why? Because maybe what caused Shimon's ultimate death was the fact that wind, right, got into the area there, hastened his death, or maybe Shimon writhed in pain, moved, and caused them to tear apart more. Therefore, you cannot attribute the entire cause of the death to Reuven, therefore there's no Galus. But I also just want to point out, that has nothing to do with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is about whether or not we could assume the husband is dead, or does somehow someone survive this particular injury. So one thing is clear. If someone has his throat slit and the majority of the windpipe and esophagus are cut, he's not surviving. He's not surviving. He's alive enough now to have someone write a get. He might be alive enough now that the person who did it might be not sent to Galus, might not be sent to Galus. But lamaisa, for our purposes of the Mishnah, such a person is called dead. So therefore, what that means is, if you were to see Ruvain with the majority of his windpipe and trachea cut, you would be permitted to go to Beis Din to give testimony, and that would allow Reuven's wife Rachel to go ahead and remarry, even though you did not see him lying dead on the ground. Top of Kof Chaf Aleph, my benayu. So I'll say the Gemara gives two interpretations as to what, or two ideas, two possibilities as to what could hasten the death of a person after they had the two simanim split. One is again Ruach, right? Ultimately, again, the Ruach got in there and ultimately hastened the death, that wind. Or second possibility is that Reuven himself writhed and moved them toward the simanim. So what's the practical difference between these two? The shachti bebesa the shisha uparches. So an afkamina could be if he, let's say Reuven accidentally cut the simanim of Shimon in a house made of marble. The assumption is in a house made of marble, there's not a wind. There's no wind. And Shimon writhed in pain, he moved. So there's no wind issue, but there is a movement issue. Inami, the shach de bibra v'lo parches. Or the other possibility is where Reuven cut the simanim of Shimon outdoors, but Shimon didn't move. In which case, there is wind, but ultimately, again, no movement. So I will say, so again, just to highlight what's coming out here, so the Mishnah gave me a principle. The principle was that halacha l'maisa, you cannot testify that someone is dead unless, of course, you see them dead. That's the way it works. What the Gemara now is saying is there may be certain exceptions to that rule. So if you know that someone has the type of injury, where halacha l'maisa, again, there's absolutely no possibility at all, in any way, shape, or form, of that person surviving, then halacha l'maisa, even if you didn't see them dead on the ground, you can't testify. Now the truth is there aren't many examples of that. The only example of that really is going to be the case of shachat bo rov shnayu, or there could be some other cases, but in that category, where again, you cut the two simanim, no cauterization, no bandaging, no remedies, nothing is going to fix that, the guy is going to die. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo kol. So let's remember again, Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah, our Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, you could only testify about a body, right? Even though we spoke about, again, facial recognition, you could only rely on facial recognition for up to 3 days after the person passed away. Rabbi Yehuda said you can't give limits like that because every case is different. Every case is different. I asked the Gemara, I'll say first wide line, Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Ibailuhu, here's the kasha, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava l'kula palik, or l'chumra palik. Rabbi says, is Rabbi Yehuda coming to be machmir, or is Rabbi Yehuda coming to be mekel? In other words, when Rabbi Yehuda argues this, he's saying that even less than 3 days, ultimately, again, perhaps you lose the ability to rely on facial recognition, or maybe he's saying, no, even more than 3 days, depending if certain circumstances are intact or are in effect, you may be able to rely on facial recognition even after 3 days. So is he being machmir? Is he being mekel? So Tashma, let's analyze. There was a guy who drowned in Karmi, and what happens? That's the place. Vasku abeheja lebasar tlasa yomin. And ultimately they took the body out. After 3 days. The Ansuva Rav Dimi min Arda ledvisu. And Rav Dimi of Narda allowed the man's wife to get remarried based on the facial recognition of the individual. So we'll say, what do you see from here? This is now more than 3 days. More than 3 days have elapsed, and you have Rav Dimi of Narda allowing facial recognition after 3 days and allowing a wife to get remarried. So the Gemara says, there's another case. Hogavra the Atba Diglas. There was another guy who drowned in the Diglas River. Vaskua Agishra Dishavisna, and they pulled him up on the bridge of Shavisna. Va'ansaba Rabba Ledvisu Apuma Dishoshvini Lebasar Hamishiyomi. And Rabba allowed his wife to get remarried after 5 days. Another story where they are again relying on facial recognition after 3 days that the person died. So says the Gemara, I Amrit Bishama Lakula Palig, Inu David Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So I understand. So if you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda is coming to be mekel, right? Rabbi Yehuda is coming to be lenient. Whereas the Tanakhama says you have up to 3 days to rely on facial recognition. Rabbi Yehuda says it depends on the circumstances. You could even have more than 3 days. See, if Rabbi Yehuda is coming to be Mekel, then it makes sense. Why? In Huda Avid Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. All of these opinions, right? These two Rabbanim in the two previous stories, Rav Dimi of Narda and Rava, were relying on Rabbi Yehuda. But if you ultimately say that Rabbi Yehuda was being more machmir than the Tanakhama, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that even less than 3 days, right? Sometimes you only have less than 3 days, in Huda Avid Kiman, then who are these Rabbanim relying on to allow facial recognition after 3 days? So very interesting. The Gemara says, I'll tell you what they're relying on. Shiny Maya Vitsamsi. Water is different. Water is different. Why? Because water causes the body to contract. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says here, Tzomsin Suras Hapanim Ve'in Manichan Osol and Foch Lishtanos. Both sides, the Rosh comments over here. He says, talking about cold water. Cold water causes the body to contract, and because the body contracts, therefore facial recognition is possible even after 3 days. 1 second, is that true? Va'amrit Maya Merzumaka. But we learned in yesterday's daf that water actually makes a wound worse. To which the Gemara says, if there's an open wound, then ultimately, again, the water will hasten the decay process. But if there's no open wound, a person just drowned, then if the water is cold, it has the ability to preserve the body for longer. But I will say there is one caveat to this. So as much as there is a possibility to rely on facial recognition even after 3 days, it does require immediate identification of the body upon being pulled from the water. Because once the body is out of the water, the Gemara says, it becomes bloated. And once it becomes bloated, there may not be the ability to properly identify it. So again, as much as there is room to say under certain circumstances, we know the body is preserved, facial recognition will work even after 5 days, but the body must be identified immediately upon being pulled from the water. Incredible. But as it says the Mishnah, here's the case. A guy falls into a body of water. Right? He's on a boat, he falls into a body of water. And I will say, now listen to this. Whether we're talking about water that has an end or water that does not have an end. So we're going to define this in the Gemara, but let me just define it for you now. So we see how it plays into the Mishnah. The concept of mayim sheyesh lahem sof means water that is surrounded by visible land on all corners. In other words, the water has an end. You could see all the banks of the body of the water. Versus mayim she'ein lahem sof means water where the banks are not visible. It's such a large body of water that you cannot see the banks of the water. So the Gemara says as follows. So if a man falls into a body of water, whether it's mayim sheyesh lahem sof, water, again, just let's define the terms once more. Mayim sheyesh lahem sof, water that has an end, refers to a body of water where you could see the banks surrounding the water. Mayim she'ein lahem sof, water without an end, such a large body of water that you cannot see the surrounding banks. So says the Gemara, Amr Rabbi Meir, so what's the halacha? Asura, ishto asura. So the first opinion Mishnah says, if a man falls into a body of water, and again, obviously we haven't retrieved the body, his wife is asura. His wife is not permitted to go ahead and remarry. And Rashi says over here, Ishto asura, shemala acher prishaso misham yata v'halachlo. The Rabbi Meir adim yachal. So the idea of Rabbi Meir says, listen, it's possible that maybe he found the way out. Maybe he swam somewhere. Maybe he found some underwater air pocket, whatever it is. Halacha Rabbi Meir, we'll see in the Gemara what it is. But Rabbi Meir says you don't allow his wife to remarry until we find a body. Says the Gemara, I'm Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, so there was a story. Here's a story. A man who fell into a very large water cistern. And what happened? And he came out of the cistern after 3 days. 3 days he survived in the water cistern. I will say, what that means, how a person survived underwater for 3 days, we're going to discuss in the Gemara. Fine. I'm Rabbi Yossi. There was once a story of a blind man who went into a pool of water which was in a cave in order to go ahead and immerse himself. The Yarad Moshcha Acharav, he had another guy, Moshcha literally is like a guide, right? He had somebody accompanying him. The guy went in afterwards. Vishoka Deshatetze Nafsham. Ultimately, the two men were seemingly under the water for a very long time, enough time to assume they died. And what happened? And ultimately, again, the rabbis allowed their wives to remarry. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, so I just want to point out, this is very interesting. Rabbi Yossi says, a pool of water in a cave is mayim sheyesh lahem sof, right? It's a water with an end. You can see the banks, so to speak, on all the sides. Yet Rabbi Yossi feels even in mayim sheyesh lahem sof, if a man is submerged enough time to assume that there's no way he could live, you could allow his wife to go and remarry. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara tells a story. V'shuv ma'aseh ba'asya. So another story, Asya, we actually read this story in yesterday's daf. So what happens? They lowered a guy down into the water. And when they pulled him back, the only thing they were able to retrieve was his foot. It depends how much of the leg they retrieved. If they retrieved a part of the leg from below the knee, then ultimately, again, it's possible the person survived such an injury, and therefore his wife cannot go ahead and remarry. But if you retrieve the leg from above the knee, we assume a person cannot survive that type of traumatic injury, and therefore the wife is permitted to get remarried. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon, Nafal Amayim bein sheish lahem sof, bein she'ein lahem sof, Ishta Asura, Div Rabbi Meir. I will say Rabbi Meir does not make any distinction in bodies of water. Right, Rabbi Meir holds whether a man falls into mayim sheyesh lahem sof, water again where the banks are visible, or mayim she'ein lahem sof, where the body of water is so big that the banks are not visible. Rabbi Meir says a woman cannot remarry; she has to wait until there is a body that is retrieved. They disagree. Let's listen to this. Chum omrim mayim sheyesh lahem sof ishta mutaras. So Chum say like this: if it's mayim sheyesh lahem sof, if it's water where the banks are visible, then halacha l'maisa the woman could remarry. V'she'ein lahem sof ishta asura. But again, water without end, i.e. the banks are not visible, ultimately she's asura. We'll say, what's the logic? And this is actually halacha l'maisa. What's the logic? We'll say, you see, mayim sheyesh lahem sof, where all the banks are visible. If the husband survived, we would have seen him coming out somewhere. We would have seen him. So therefore, again, in mayim sheyesh lahem sof, water where the banks are visible on all sides, halacha l'maisa, if you don't retrieve a body, even if you don't retrieve a body, halacha l'maisa, you could allow the woman to remarry because we assume the husband is dead. If he wasn't dead, we would have seen him on one of the banks. Conversely, mayim she'ein lahem sof, water for which you can't see the surrounding banks, it's possible the husband swam out somewhere and swam to safety somehow, and we just can't see him. Because of that, the wife cannot remarry unless, of course, they retrieve a body. So says the Gemara, what's the example of mayim sheyesh lahem sof? What's the example of that? Explicitly here it is, any body of water where you could stand and you could see all four surrounding banks of the body of water. So we'll say an interesting story. Hahu Gavra, the Tava Ba'agma Demaski. And we'll say there was a guy who drowned in the Agma Demaski. So we'll say the name of the place is Maski. Agam is a marsh. So the guy drowned in the marsh of Maski. Ansaba Rav Shila Dvisu. Rav Shila, obviously they didn't retrieve a body, and Rav Shila allowed his wife to go ahead and remarry. Now we'll say this is actually very interesting. So we are assuming. Well, let's see the case. So Rav Shila allowed the woman to remarry, even though they did not retrieve a body. Amrali Rav l'Shmuel. Rav said to Shmuel, Ta neshamte. We need to excommunicate Rav Shila because he paskined erroneously. After all, again, I will say the halacha is, we would think a marsh is mayim sheyesh lahem sof, right? A marsh ultimately, again, is a body of water that has defined boundaries. You can see the banks. So therefore, again, the only way to, right? So therefore, halacha l'maisa, if he was alive, well, actually, I'm jumping ahead. Rav wanted to excommunicate him. Let's see. So Tana Shamte, Amrale, was a great story. Amrale, nishlach le bereisha. So Shmuel says, before we excommunicate him, maybe we should just ask him why he did what he did. Rabbi say, what a profound exchange, right? Rav feels that Rav Shila erred in his ruling, right? He should not have allowed the woman to remarry, right? That was the mistake. So Shmuel says, hold on, before you excommunicate him, let's talk. Rabbi say, how many times are there fractured relationships because people jump to conclusions, act on those conclusions, ruin relationships because of things they think happen. Instead, just take the time to ask. Just ask what happened. Just inquire. Just have a conversation. So sure enough, Shmuel does this. Amar li Rav the Shmuel. So the Gemara says, Shalchulei. So Shmuel sent a message to Rav Shila. Ma'im she'ein lahem sof ishta asura umuteres. So Shmuel asked Rav Shila the following shayla. Rav Shila, tell me, if a man is lost in a body of water, and it's a body of water, she'ein lahem sof, it's a body of water that you can't see the surrounding banks, what's the halacha? Is the wife mutter or asura? Shalach lehu ishto asura. So Rav Shila says, of course, the wife is asura, because I can't see the surrounding banks. Maybe he swam out to safety somewhere, and therefore in the absence of a body, you can't allow the wife to remarry. So says the Gemara of Agma, so says Shmuel, Agma de Samki, Mayim sheyesh lahem sof, or Mayim she'ein lahem sof. So Shmuel says, Rav Shila, tell me, the marsh of Samki, is that a Mayim sheyesh lahem sof, or Mayim she'ein lahem sof? Watch this. Shalach lehu, Mayim she'ein lahem sof. Rav Shila said, the marsh of Samki is Mayim she'ein lahem sof. Ultimately, again, it's water without defined or discernible or visible boundaries. We're going to see, because in this marsh there were waves that actually funneled the water, or I should say, push things into larger bodies of water. It's ma'im she'ein lahem sof. So Umar, my time avadachi. So Rav Shila, tell me, if the marsh of Samki is ma'im she'ein lahem sof, water without defined boundaries, then how did you allow this woman to remarry without retrieving a body? So the Gemara says, so Rav Shila said, you're right. So the Gemara says, mita ta'ina ana, right? I made a mistake. Savar kevan de kavi kavu v'kaimi k'mam sheish lahem sof dami. I thought that because a marsh is standing water, therefore it has the status of mayim sheyesh lahem sof. But I made a mistake. Velohi kevan dika gali emar gali ashpalu. But I made a mistake, because then I saw the marsh has waves. And because the marsh has waves, therefore it has the status, right? The waves move things out of this body of water. And therefore, again, the marsh will have the status of mayim she'ein lahem sof. So I will say, what an incredible story. Rav Shila said to Shmuel, I made a mistake. I made a wrong ruling. I paskined incorrectly. So I will say, listen how the story ends. Kari Shmuel idirav lo ye'una letzadek ka'aven. So I will say, listen to this. Shmuel said about Rav. So Rav, about you, the pasuk can be said, lo ye'una letzadek ka'aven, that nothing bad happens to a tzaddik, or through a tzaddik, nothing evil will occur. So Shmuel was saying, it was like this, Rav, you were ready to excommunicate the guy. But Baruch Hashem, we asked a couple of questions, and therefore a wrongful excommunication didn't happen through you, Rav. To which Rav says, Kari alei Rav de Shmuel uteshua b'Rav Yoetz. So Rav said about Shmuel, the pasuk in Mishlei, a beautiful pasuk, shua b'Rav Yoetz, salvation can be found from those who seek out counsel. So ultimately, again, Rav says, the truth is, Shmuel, because I leaned on your advice, ultimately, again, I did not make the mistake. And I will say, the truth is, such a beautiful Gemara, you can really read it as a cause and effect. That in reality, how does the righteous person ensure that nothing bad happens through him? Ask the advice of others. See, I will say, the common theme over here is that Rav engages Shmuel, therefore is able to benefit from the advice of Shmuel. Shmuel decides not to act without actually talking to the involved party. We'll say, what an incredible musar. How many mistakes we make in life because we jump to conclusions, we fail to clarify, we fail to dialogue. And if only we would just take the time to get to the bottom of things. Don't assume, right? Don't make assumptions. Don't jump to conclusions. Ask questions. Rav spoke to Shmuel, Baruch Hashem, he sought out advice. Ask advice. You're faced with something difficult, you're faced with something overwhelming, you're faced with something with serious repercussions for yourself and others. Don't go at it alone. Ask for advice. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Maiseh b'shnei b'nei Adam machmurin. So let's listen to this. Biardin. There were two guys who were laying nets. They're fishermen. They were laying nets in the Jordan River. One of them went in. Mechila shel dagim literally means a tunnel of fish. So it must have been that they were by the banks of the river, and the fish burrowed into the banks. The Rebbe says something interesting happened. So one of the guys swam into like the burrow, like the fish tunnel, in order to go out and put a net. What happened? As he's inside of the fish tunnel, the Rebbe said there's an air pocket in the fish tunnel. So he's in the fish tunnel, laying the nets, there's an air pocket. The sun goes down. Because the sun went down, he was unable to see his way out of the fish tunnel. So what happened? Shabbos said his friend is waiting there on the boat. And again, amount of time goes by, and he says, Nebuch, my friend died. My friend died. The friend who went under to lay the nets, he died. And what happened? And we'll call him Ruvain, who was on the boat, goes to Shimon's family, tells them tragic fishing accident. Shimon died. Meanwhile, Shimon's in the fish tunnel with an air pocket, waiting for sunrise. What happened? Baruch Hashem, the next morning, what happened? The sun came up, and Shimon was able to find the exit for the fish tunnel. Says the Gemara, Uba, so Shimon comes home, tired, exhausted, wet. And what does he find in his house? Uba umatza hespid gadol b'soch beso. And what does he find? He finds again eulogies, levayas, mamish levaya. Can you imagine? Shimon showed up at his own levaya. So what happened? Amar Rebbe, when he heard this story, said, Kama gidolim divrei chachamim, she'amru mayim sheyesh lahem sof ishto muteres, she'ein lahem sof ishto asura. Shabbos said, listen to this. How wise is the chacham? Shabbos said, the Yarden, the Jordan River, was considered to be mayim she'ein lahem sof, water without discernible boundaries. So because of that, in reality, this was a case where they should not have assumed Shimon was dead. They still assumed Shimon was dead. They made his levaya, and what do you see? They were wrong. So Rebbe sees this mice, and he sees, you see how wise the Chachamim are. Incredible. So the Gemara says, one second, if that's the case, that there are these concepts of fish tunnels, right, where there are air pockets in there, even in a case of Ma'im Sheyesh Lahem Sof, even where it's a body of water where you could see all the banks. And I'm about to say, in that case, generally, if you don't see the husband going up, even if you haven't retrieved the body, you could assume that he's dead. I warrant the choshesh for fish tunnels, even in Ma'im She'ein Lahem Sof, Sheyesh Lahem Sof, to which the Gemara says, Mechila Shal Dagim, B'Ma'im Sheyesh Lahem Sof, Mechila Shal Dagim Lo Shricha. So apparently those fish tunnels are really only found in larger bodies of water, not in smaller bodies of water. Incredible. So Amar Rabashi, Hada Rabbana Mayim She'ein Lem Sof Ishto Asura. Shabbos say that which the rabbi said, that in Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof, ultimately the wife is Asura. Now say, so again, just to review this halacha, this is halacha l'maisa. A man falls into a body of water, Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof, water where you can't see the surrounding banks. The halacha is the wife cannot get remarried. Why? Because since it's such a large body of water, maybe the husband swam out somewhere, found safety somewhere, survived somewhere. So unless, of course, you find the body, halacha l'maisa, you cannot go and allow her to remarry. So the Gemara says, Hani mili be'inish da'alma. That's only true with a regular guy. Listen to this. Aval tzura mirabanon lo. But halacha l'maisa, a Talmid Chacham, it's not the case. Why? Because if a Talmid Chacham really did survive and he came out somewhere else, kala islay. People talk about it. The Talmidei Chachamim are famous. If the Talmid Chacham survived, people would know about it. To which the Gemara says, "Velohi, it's not true. Loshna inish ta'almo, veloshna tzura mirabanan." But say it doesn't make a difference who the person who fell in, whether he's a Talmid Chacham and he's famous, a regular guy. Either way, Rabbi say the halach is the same. Namely, and Rabbi say this is very important. So when a person falls in, when a man falls into mayim sheyesh lahem sof, right, water where there are discernible boundaries, Rabbi say we could see if he's coming out. So when we don't see that he's coming out, we assume that what? He is dead. He is dead, even if we don't retrieve a body, and therefore his wife could get remarried. Conversely, mayim she'ein lahem sof, where we can't see the boundaries, we don't know what happened. And because we don't know what happened, unless you retrieve a body, the wife is prohibited to get remarried. Now, both said that's the halacha. The Gemara gives an interesting caveat. The Gemara says, "The evet in lechatchila lo." So Rabbi said this is actually very interesting. So halacha l'maisa, in a case of mayim she'ein lahem sof, right? Water without boundaries. So we say a woman is not permitted to get remarried if her husband fell into that body of water until they retrieve a body. The Gemara just says something very interesting. That is true lechatchila. B'diavad, if she went ahead and she got married anyway, we would not force her to leave husband number two. Interesting idea. So halacha l'maisa b'diavad, if she went and remarried against halachic advice, we would allow her to remain married to husband number two. Incredible. Abosai, look at this story. I feel like a Gemara like this. We've worked so hard on Maseches Yevamos. It's overwhelming. I feel like this Masechta has been just an avoda, because it's intricate, because it's long. It's been a trek. Like this is the Mount Everest of Gemaras, and we're right about to get to the zenith, to the apex, the top of the mountain. I'll just point out something amazing. Sometimes when you work so hard on something, so Kadosh Baruch Hu Kadosh Baruch Hu gives you such a beautiful present. These Gemaras that we're going to do now are presents. Listen to this. Tanya Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel says, Pam achas hayisi mehalich b'sfina. One time I was traveling by boat. And I saw that there was another boat traveling nearby, and it was slammed by stormy seas, and it broke. And traveling on that boat was a great Talmid Chacham, and I was so sad because after a boat is demolished like that boat, no one survived. And I was sad that a great Talmid Chacham was lost. Who was the great Talmid Chacham? Who was the great Talmid who was on that boat? Ummanu, Rabbi Akiva. It was none other than Rabbi Akiva who was on that storm-tossed boat that capsized, that broke apart. Rabbi Gamliel was sure that he was dead. When I came to dry land, who walks into the base medrash? None other than Rabbi Akiva. Heilige Rabbi Akiva survived. Says Rabbi Gamliel, Amarti lo b'ni, miya elacha, my son, how did you survive? Literally, who took you out? I saw that. I saw what happened to your boat. You capsized in the middle of the ocean. The storm broke it apart. How did you survive? But say, listen to these words. Amar li, Rabbi Akiva said, Daf shel sfina nizdameli. A daf means a board. A board of them. I grabbed onto a board of the boat. V'chalgal v'gal sheba alai, and every wave that came over me, na'anisi li roshi, I bowed my head into it. So I will say, the Lubliner Rav Meir Shapiro of Lublin, our spiritual father, our Rebbe, the father of the Daf Yomi, the Lubliner Rav quoted this Gemara, and the Lubliner Rav says that life is filled with so many challenges. Life is filled with so many stormy waters, so many difficulties, so many overwhelming situations in life. How do you anchor yourself? How do you survive? Said the Lubliner Rav, we learn from Rabbi Akiva, hold on to the daf. Hold on to the daf. Rabbi Akiva held on to a daf, a piece of a boat, a board. We hold on to the daf. I hold on to the daf. I hold on to the daf each and every day. This daf keeps me afloat. This daf allows me to survive. This daf keeps me grounded in a life that is sometimes so overwhelming and turbulent. Because you know what the incredible thing is? Everything else could change. You know what the one thing that remains a constant is the daf. Today's Kuf Chaf Aleph. Tomorrow's going to be Kuf Chaf Beis. Friday's going to be Ksuvis Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Shabbos Daf Gimel. It's a stabilizing force. In the world of stormy seas, the one thing that anchors us, the one thing that keeps us afloat, the one thing that keeps us alive is the daf. Hold on to the daf, and you will be able to make your way through the stormiest of seas. Incredible Gemara. Now, Rabbi Akiva adds in something else. He says, every time there was a big wave that was going to come over me, I bowed my head. Right? I bowed my head into the wave. So the Gemara says, from here the Chachamim said something very important. If Rishaim come to attack a person, bow your head. Now what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says, first of all, Na'anesi lo roshi. Rabbi Akiva says, I bowed my head in front of the waves. Rashi says, Va'avra al gabi v'halach lo. When you bow your head, the wave passes over. The wave passes over, right? If you stick your head up, the wave slaps you in the face. Bow your head, the wave passes over. So the Gemara says this is an incredible metaphor. Rashi says, Both said this is incredible. There are times in life where you have to take a stand, and there are times in life where you have to fight back, and there are also times in life where you kind of just have to grin it and bear it. In other words, bow your head and let the storm pass. There are some people who are ready to fight every single fight, every single battle. We'll say, if you fight every single battle, like, first of all, you'll be spent before you know it, right? You'll run out of energy, run out of steam to really accomplish anything great in life. And not every battle is worth fighting. Not every battle has to be fought. Sometimes just give the other side a win. It just doesn't matter. So the Gemara says, sometimes, we always have waves. There are always waves coming at us. So a lot of times, like, I want to stand up to the wave, and sometimes you have to. But many times, what you also have to do is just duck your head. Just duck your head. It's not worth it. It's not worth the fight. It's not worth the machlokas. It's not worth the caustic encounter. Bow your head and just let the wave pass right over you. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Amarti ba'osa shah, kama gidom divrei chachamim. See how great the words of the chachamim are. Sha'amru mayim sheyesh lahem sof mutares, mayim she'en lahem sof asura. Rabbi will say once again, here's a case. Rabbi Akiva went down in a boat in Mayim, she'en lahem sof. Here Rabbi Gamliel was convinced that he was dead, but he wasn't. Rabbi Akiva was dead, but he wasn't. Incredible. Tanya, I'm Rabbi Akiva. So we'll say now let's start with Rabbi Akiva. Listen to this. I'm Rabbi Akiva. Pam achas heisi mehalich besina, v'ra'isi sina achas shemetarefes bayam. We'll say now, again, another story. Rabbi Akiva's on the boat, and he sees another boat next to him, and the boat is getting tossed by the stormy seas. Mamish about to be broken apart. Vayisi mitzta'er al Talmid Chacham sheba. And Rabbi Akiva says, I was so distressed about a certain Talmid Chacham who was on that boat, who I figured was obviously going to be dead. And who was it? Umanu, Rabbi Meir. It was Rabbi Meir. Ukishalisi the Medina kapotkia. And sure, Rabbi Akiva says, I got on dry land, I'm in the kapotkia, I'm in the basement, and who walks in? Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir. Amarti lo bini, mei ha'elacha. I said to my son, how did you survive? Amrali, gal taradani lechavero, v'chaver lechavero, ad shiki ani leyabasha. Rabbi Meir says something amazing. He says, one wave took me to another wave, until it brought me to dry land. Both say incredible. Amarti. So both Amarti, both Rabbi Akiva said in that moment, Kama Gidol Divrei Chacham Sha'amru, Mayim Sheyesh Lahem Sof Ishto Muteres, Mayim She'en Lahem Sof Ishto Asura. And Rabbi Akiva once again said, this really backs up the greatness of the Chachamim. Because again, Rabbi Meir went down in a body of water that was Mayim She'en Lahem Sof, no discernible boundaries. And therefore, again, Rabbi Akiva thought he was dead, but yet he wasn't dead. Rabbi Akiva says, you see from it, the Chachamim really know what they're talking about. I will say, the imagery here also is so beautiful of one wave being taken to the next wave, being taken to the next wave. I will say, the interesting thing about waves is, remember again, wherever there's a wave, like there's like a peak, there's a valley in between. So the waves of the ocean are an incredible metaphor for life. Life is never a series of peaks, nor is it a series of valleys. It's a series of peaks and valleys. I will say, what's the yesod in life? The yesod in life is that when you're riding a wave, when things are going well in life, use the energy of the simcha, use the energy of the tova, use the energy of the good times to propel yourself forward. You see, so many times in life, when things are going well, we sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. But what you always have to remember is, after every wave, after every peak is a valley. So if I use the wave to muster up the energy to do something great, then I could propel myself wave to wave to wave. That's how I could survive. And that's what also allows me to go ahead and really make it past the valleys or the depressions in life. Use the waves. Don't sit back, relax, and enjoy the show when everything is going well. Use those times of serenity. Use those times of bracha to muster up the strength and do something great. So the Gemara goes weiter. So we'll say some other cases. We'll listen to this. Let's say a guy falls into a lion's den. You see Reuven fall into a lion's den. So what's the shaila? The shaila is, can I go ahead and testify that he's dead? A guy falls, I didn't see him devoured by the lions, but chances are guys who fall. So the Gemara says no. No, we'll see why that is in just a moment. However, if a person falls into a pit, filled with snakes and scorpions, you could absolutely assume he is dead. And you could testify to that effect. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda says even if he falls into a pit filled with snakes and scorpions, you can't testify about him. He might still be alive. How so? Maybe he is a chabar. Rabbi say, what's a chabar? A chabar is a snake charmer. Interesting. Maybe the guy is a snake charmer. See, he knows how to, I don't know, snake whisperer, snake talker, snake singer, whatever he is. He knows something. Some people know how to charm snakes. So halacha, maybe that's how he survived. Why does Tanakama disagree? Tanakama says, Agav itzitza maskile. Since the guy is falling into the pit with the snakes and scorpions and he falls on them, by definition, the act of falling on them is going to trigger them to bite and to sting. Therefore, the guy is dead. So Tanrabban, now interesting, Rashi points out, so what about the lions then? Here's the interesting part about the lions then. If the lions are full, let's say Reuven falls in, but Baruch Hashem, right before Reuven fell in, it was feeding time at the zoo. So Baruch Hashem, he fell in, but Lamaisi didn't fall into a den of hungry lions, right? Baruch Hashem, they ate, they're good. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, one need not worry. So one could fall into the lion's den and yet still have the possibility that halacha l'maisa, the lions won't eat him. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says as follows: Tanrabanan, nafal l'sol kivshan eish. What happens if halacha l'maisa, a person falls into a fiery furnace? What's the status then? So me'idin alav. So ultimately, again, we could testify that he's dead. Liyora melea mayim b'shemen. What happens if a person falls into a vat, is a vat sitting on top of fire, filled with oil or filled with wine? So me'idin alav, me'idin alav. So we'll say halacha l'maisa, he's dead. Rabbi Acha Omer shal shemen me'idin alav. If he fell into a vat of oil, then he's dead. Mipnei shu mavir. Because it will say, if he falls into the vat of oil, some of the oil spills out, that intensifies the fire, heats up the vat, the guy is dead. But ultimately, again, I will say, in a vat of wine, when he falls in and displaces with the wine actually extinguishes some of the fire, cools down the fire, maybe he could survive. While it's true that maybe initially some of the wine spills out, and ultimately goes ahead and extinguishes the fire, then the fire comes back with a greater gusto. Okay, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, whether he falls into a vat of wine or burning oil that's on top of a fire, we could testify that such an individual is in fact dead. So the Gemara goes right there. So remember, Rabbi Meir tells the story of a guy who fell into the large water cistern. And remember again, the Mishnah says he came out after 3 days. Says Tanya, Rabbi Meir, whatever happened with this guy, it was a miracle. And we don't bring a raya from miracles. We don't bring a raya from miracles. So what was miraculous about this guy surviving for 3 days? Maybe he said he didn't eat or drink for 3 days. That's not so miraculous. Esther Malka says, before she goes into Achashverosh, fast for me. And how long do they fast for? 3 days. 3 days. So you see from here that a person could fast for 3 days. Ela delo nayim. Rather, we're going to say what's impossible over here is that halacha l'maisa, he didn't sleep for 3 days. I will say what I want to point out over here is like this. We are presupposing that obviously the guy did not survive underwater for 3 days. In other words, there must have been an air pocket. So we're assuming he found the air pocket, that's how he's breathing. So what's miraculous? So it can't be that he didn't eat or drink, because a person could survive without food and water for 3 days. So what's miraculous? That he didn't sleep for 3 days. A human being can't go without sleep for 3 days. After all, the Gemara says, if a person takes a shvuah, I swear I'm not going to sleep for 3 days. Malkin also v'yashin altar. We'll say such a shvuah like that is a shvuah shav. It's a false shvuah, meaningless shvuah. We give him malchus for taking a false oath, or meaningless oath, and we put him to bed immediately. In other words, he could go to sleep immediately. So then Rabbi Meir said, my time, out of Kana, keep an agavi, keep an havu. It must be that this guy discovered, I will say, that in the water cistern were like arches. So therefore, maybe he was able just to kind of put himself on one of the arches, and grab a little bit of sleep. Like that, V'Rabbanan, the Shisha. Rabbanan say the arches were made of marble, usually. And they both say marble is very slippery. A person can't sleep on top of wet marble. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Meir will say, listen, not saying that he got it wasn't like a posturepedic bed, but Lamaisa again, he could situate himself a little bit that he could doze at least a little bit to be able to catch a little bit of sleep to be able to sustain himself. Incredible. Tan Rabbanon. So let's listen to this. There was a story with the daughter of Nechunya Chofer Sichin. Then I will say, if you look at Rashi, Chofer Sichin, Lo Ove Regalim, Umay Miskansim and Bahayu Shosim. We'll say Sichin are wells. Nechunya used to dig wells. Who would he dig wells for? He would dig wells for the Ole Regalim. For those Jews who were coming up from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, that they should have water sources. So this guy Nechunya did this out of the goodness of his heart. He dug wells for the Ole Regel. One time his own daughter fell into a well. They came and they told Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. So what happened? Shah Rishona Amar Shalom. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said in the first hour after she fell in, she's fine. Shnia Amar Lahem Shalom. Second hour, he told them she's still fine. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is saying about the daughter of Nechunya, she's okay, she survived. Shlishis Amar. So by the third hour, so Rabbi Dosa says to everyone assembled, she's been taken out. She's been saved. She's been taken out of the water cistern. Amar la biti. So Amar la biti mihalacha. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said to her, "Tell me, my daughter, who took you out of the water cistern? Who took you out of the well?" Both said, "Listen to this." Amar lo zachar sharechelim nizdamili. I saw a male ram. I saw a ram. V'zakin manhiko. An old man was leading the ram. And ultimately, again, they saved me. Rashi says, what does this mean? This refers to the ram of Yitzchak. Zaken, who was the old man leading the ram, none other than Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu leading the ram, the ram of Akedas Yitzchak, saved the daughter of Nechunya. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Amrulo, Navi Ata, so the students of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, Rebbe, are you a Navi? You knew she was okay hour 1. You knew she was okay hour 2. And then hour 3, you knew that she was saved. Are you a Navi? Amar lahem lo Navi anochi v'lo ben Navi anochi. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. Elo davar shat tzadik misasik bo yikashav al zaro. He says, listen what Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says. Rabbi Nechunya Chofer Sichin, this guy Nechunya Chofer Sichin, he devoted his life to digging wells for Jews. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says, is it possible that the very chesed he did for Am Yisrael is going to be a source of his misfortune? So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, it can't be that his daughter is going to die by falling into a well. Impossible. This is the very vehicle of his chesed. Impossible that it is going to be the source of his misfortune. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba Afa Pikein Meis Bino B'Tzama. Also, just there's a unfortunate, the tragic postscript, that as much as Nechunya Chofer Sichin, his daughter was saved, his son died, and amazing of his son died of thirst. So the Gemara says, Shnei Amar Usediva Nisara Ma'od. Literally again, and around him is very turbulent. Around him is very turbulent. What does this mean? Malamed she'Hakadosh Baruch Hu medaktek im sviv chut hasayra. I will say it's a little bit of a play on words. So nisara ma'od ultimately means turbulent, but sa'ara also means a hair. When it comes to the righteous, HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges them with incredible precision. That even an infraction that for a regular person, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would forgive and move on and overlook, the righteous are often examined under a profound microscope. So we don't know what happened with Nechunya Chofer Sichin. We don't know what happened, but Lamaisa, he lost the son. And the Gemara understands, how could someone who did so much chesed suffer such a tragic loss? To which the Gemara answers that HaKadosh Baruch Hu deals with the tzaddikim kichut hasayra, like the hair's breadth, that he's incredibly particular with them, incredibly meticulous with them, and their deeds are looked at under the microscope. Rabbi Chanina Armehacha kel na'aras b'sod kidoshim rabba v'nora kol savivav. That literally again, both if you look at Rashi over here, kel na'aras b'sod kidoshim. That literally again, a dreadful God, which is the HaKadosh Baruch Hu deals with din. Besod Kidoshim, within those who are holiest to him, the Rabba V'nora Kol Savivav, that very often it's those who are closest to the Ribono Shel Olam that often are dealt with an incredible measure of divine strict justice. an incredible Gemara Bosai. Let's go back for just a moment. Why is it that halacha lamaisa? Why is it halacha lamaisa that the daughter of Nechunya Chofer Sichin is saved by Avraham Avinu together with the Akedas Yitzchak? What's the pshat in that? So I think it's incredible. Akedas Yitzchak, right? Avraham Avinu is the Isha Chesed. That's what Avraham Avinu represents. He's all Chesed. And one might have thought that sometimes the greatest Chesed that you could do is a willingness to give of yourself totally to Hashem. I take myself and I give it to the Ribono Shel Olam. I give myself to you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One might have thought that that is the greatest chesed you could do. Kamashon, the Gemara says no. The greatest chesed, the greatest kindness that a person does is not a giving of themselves over to Hashem. That's great, but even greater than that is giving of yourself over to others. Nechon Yisrael will say that's the chap over here. Avraham Avinu, with the ram of Yitzchak, comes to save the daughter of Nechunya Chofer Sichin. Why? Because Nechunya gave himself over to others. Nechunya was there for others. And when you are there for others, when you give yourself over for others, to a certain degree, you're Abrahamic. But not Avraham Avinu Ba'akedah. Avraham Avinu Ba'akedah is incredible. But Lamaisa, Avraham Avinu, who gave himself over to others. So Avraham Avinu brings the ram of the Akedah to save this girl. Because the greatest chesed we do in life is not giving ourselves over to Hashem, but it's giving of ourselves to each and every Jew. It's giving of ourselves to others. That is the highest form of chesed. I will say, let's go a little bit weiter. We'll do the Mishnah, then we'll stop. Afilu shema min anashim omeres meis ish ploni dayo. Mishnah goes on and says that halacha lemaisa, even if a person goes ahead. Actually, we'll say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up at the Mishnah Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Again, what an incredible zechus to be able to learn this daf with all of you. We'll stop over here for today. Tremendous yashakayach. Looking forward to picking up at the Mishnah for our last daf of Daf Yomi Haba Aleinu Latova on Thursday morning in Meretz Hashem. I will say shkoyach.